Welcome to the Product Expert Fireside webinar that we're running here today. I'm glad to have you here. It's a series of webinars that we run. We've had a bunch of these over the last couple of years. The talks are always recorded, and it's always a mixture of either presentations or firesides or a mixture of, and we always have amazing guests, experts who join us. And it's always with this focus on the content, on the learning, on sharing, on hearing from their experiences that they bring from their lives as product people. So today is going to be recorded and shared, and you will have a chance to ask questions. By all means, jump in there with your Q&A, with your questions, and we will definitely try to get a chance to answer all of those. And I will jump in and give you an intro to Krishna Panicker, our guest, in just a moment. But I did want to just introduce ProdPad, tell you a little bit about that before we get started. This is originally a tool that was built by myself and my co-founder, Simon. When we were both product managers, we basically just needed tools to do our own jobs. It didn't exist. We needed something to keep track of experiments we were running. We needed something to help us hit the business objectives that we were given and help solve customer problems and just keep tabs on ideas and feedback that made up our backlog. And so building ProdPad gave us control and organization and transparency. And so it wasn't long after we built it that we shared it with the product people around us. And today it's being used by thousands of teams around the world. So thank you to all of you ProdPad users out there. It's free to try, so please jump in there and give it a try. We even have a sandbox mode where you have example product management data. You have things like lean roadmaps and OKRs, experiments and feedback, and you can see how everything fits together in a product management space. And our team is made up of product people, not just founders, but throughout the team. Start a trial, try it out. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear how you're getting on with it. Let us know what works, and we'd love to hear from product people like ourselves. So on that note, let me jump in and introduce our guest. This is Krishna Panicker. Now, how I know Krishna, we actually met up earlier this year. It was at a CPO happy hour hosted by Bruce McCarthy, who was our guest here. I think it was in January we had Bruce McCarthy on. And we had a couple of drinks, Krishna and I we were hanging out at this happy hour. And I realized that Krishna's way of talking about product management, particularly this concept of value stacking, was really interesting. And he's also got this wealth of knowledge and experience from his years as a product person. So he's currently the VP of product at Airbase, and he's previously been product at Microsoft, Skype, Pipedrive, and Blink. So I'm really excited to hear from Krishna today. I'm really excited to have you here, Krishna. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone in the chat, please give Krishna a warm welcome.
Thank you. I'm even more excited to be a guest on your show.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for joining us here today. So again, thanks so much for joining us and bringing up this topic of value stacking, which is what we got to when we were chatting at the bar earlier this year. So what is value stacking? Because it's a new concept to me, and I think it's going to be a new concept to a lot of people here.
Yeah, so let me just maybe step back as to why I put this together. So I was really struggling myself as a PM. I'd be having very constructive discussions and arguments about how we prioritize. And I had this unstructured concept in my head, and I found it hard to articulate, right? So what I would do is I'd give this 10 minutes of context setting every time. And it was just taking too long. Every time I had to get everyone in the same context. And so I had to find a way of summarizing that, and just, it helps sometimes. Giving something a name just helps people to get context very quickly.
A shared vocabulary.
Yeah, and if I may, I'll share, I shared the story earlier. I knew it was kind of working when I experimented with the terminology, and I'll go into what it is, but it's kind of like thinking of like domino effect or domino cascade and value cascade, and then value stacking as a term just stuck. I was kind of, I won't call it A/B testing, but I was just experimenting with the term. And then I knew it worked when one of my previous colleagues, she said to me, "You'd be very proud of me, Krish. I value stacked the shit out of my roadmap." And then I thought, okay, this seems to be resonating with a couple of people. Let me just explain. Let me now dive into what it might be. And I just think some visuals might help here. So if I may, I will just
of course.
Screen share.
Let me stop mine and then you can share.
Let's have a look. Okay, so start here, if we can see my screen. And so I'll start with, firstly, this idea of growth. And one thing kind of one insight that I had working at a number of organizations is we talk about growth, but I kind of really saw there being two types of growth, right? And so there's what I call fast growth, which is typically, quite additive, and it's the ability to derive growth relatively quickly. It often looks linear. And there's another type of growth, which I think of as high growth, right? And this is where you can potentially, the idea here is you can actually compound a set of opportunities together. So you extract a lot more growth. And it's not like one is better than the other, by the way. I mean, I think of that crossover point arguably as, somewhere around the lines of product market fit. And if you've got a short runway, you really want to go fast. You want fast growth. But actually, if you have an extended runway, then you might want to think about high growth. And so as I explored this idea of high growth, I started thinking about this. And this is really my very dumbed down way of explaining this, right? Imagine you have a set of opportunities, and I'll give each one a value, right? These could be valued any way you want, let's say, but I've just given it these numbers, a 6, a 5, and a 4. A 6 is worth more than a 5, a 5 is worth more than a 4. And if you work on this set of opportunities, it's worth a certain amount, right? So here, this adds up to 15. And what if you take another set of opportunities that are similar, but maybe worth a little less, right? I take a 5, I take a 4, I take a 3, and that gives you a certain value. Now, we work in product. We know nothing is ever as simple as this. That would be great, right? But let's just bear with me for a moment. But this is the struggle that I had in my conversations, because anyone in their right mind would choose the top set of opportunities, right? You would choose the 6 over the 5, or the 5 over the 4, or the 4 over the 3, as you should, right? Because as a set, the 15 is higher than the 12. And my premise is, what if you could work on a set of opportunities that, when compounded, right, give a different result? So what if, instead of looking at this as as additives, we look at these as multipliers, right? And that changes things entirely, because now we get something that looks like this, right? And now, by seemingly working on things that have less value in isolation, in fact, can compound worth something much more, right? And so that's let's say, the abstract version of value stacking. And maybe if I just double click into this a bit more to flesh out an example, and then maybe we can pause. Happy to take questions after that. And the example I give, it's almost an unfair example, but I choose it just because it's easy. It's one that everyone kind of knows, Apple. God damn it. All examples seem, half of them seem to end with Apple, but
they do some good stuff.
Apparently they're worth a few trillion. So I had the earliest iPhone. So I used to geek out, like in the early days of, the smartphone, when we used to even call it smartphone, remember those terms, smartphone, feature phone? So I used to read up the release notes, and it was really interesting. I remember in 2012, I think it was, they released this feature on the phone called Passbook. And you could add, probably most people don't even remember this, right? Because it's literally 10 years ago. But you could add like cinema ticket, you could add event tickets and add them to your app, right? So you could actually have them scanned and show a barcode or QR code. That was 2012. And honestly, no one really even thought about this. They did talk about it. They made a mention of it. And I did find it peculiar. I just found, like, why would they be releasing this? Like, there's other things they could work on that have more value. And then subsequently, in 2013, they then released Touch ID, right? So you could seamlessly open your phone, no code, passcode. You can just touch the screen and now even look at the screen, and it knows who you are. So that was the year later. And it was in 2014, I would say, that the pieces started to fall into place, because that's when they released Apple Pay, right? So let's play that back. So they release these 3 in sequence, right? And I mean, could you even imagine Apple Pay without some of these elements? Let's look at these elements, because what happened was they were building a card habit for 2 years. Right. And they just changed the type of card. you put in. Guess what? 2 years later. So my thesis is they planned this all along, right? It turns out Passbook got its app name changed to Wallet. It's the same app. They just changed the types of cards you put in, right? So not just put your boarding pass, cinema tickets, and the like. It's now you've got your credit card and your debit card. So they spent 2 years building a card app, and it kind of makes sense because then a year later they then start thinking, you know what, we need to build an auth app, right? Because now this isn't actually just about getting into your phone quickly. It's about authenticating who you are. Now, can you imagine releasing Apple Pay without a wallet and an ability to authenticate who you are? No, I don't think I could. The difference is they actually unbundled it in an interesting way. And each of these had value in isolation and yet was able to compound on each other, such that now they've solidly built a pay habit, right? And that's a very simplistic example here, that there's a value of this is close to zero, I would argue, versus the other things they released. This had a relatively high value, but they sequenced this in a very interesting way to multiply value. And just to end here, I've got a couple of things. So one is that, to quote Steve Jobs, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. And I think this is a key part for value stacking. To me, is what are you value stacking towards? You need to know that. And so for me, those dots are problems. And so part of this is really understanding what's the problem behind the problem. But I'm going to pause there.
Yeah, that's a really good example because when you first outlined that, you've got the numbers at the top there. That's how a lot of product managers often think about things. You've got a bunch of ideas or a bunch of potential things that you could go solve, and you add them up and go, well, we've got this opportunity. We'll go work on the ones that have
the biggest number, right?
work on the ones that have the biggest, have the biggest rice score or whatever. Yeah. But in reality, when you actually start stacking them up that way, you start realizing that they only make sense if you can sequence them towards something that gets you that bigger problem that's going to solve down the line.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, like there are certain instances where you need that fast growth, and you have a 3-month runway. A customer wants X, build X, because it buys you more runway. But after you get so if you work at a startup, sure, you might need to think about things differently. But post that, you might want to really start thinking about this as not just a single opportunity, but a set of opportunities, and thinking about how you value stack.
Yeah. No, I'd actually disagree with Steve Jobs' point about you're not able to connect the dots until, in the future. You can only connect them in the past, sort of thing. Because, arguably, that's what Apple did. They drew the dots and then the line was connected later, right? That's essentially what we're doing when we're creating a strategy. They just created one that was very compelling, but not very obvious to people as they were doing it.
Yeah, the strategy, I think, was really hidden in plain sight. And I think we're saying the same thing, except that what I think and I think good PMs do well, is they have the ability sometimes to teleport into the future, right? To imagine what that future looks like, and then to unpack it into the present.
Yeah, and that's actually a skill in itself. So I remember reading something at some point in time that pointed out that humans have this aversion, this inability to empathize with their future selves. They have this inability to visualize themselves in the future, right? So if you try to sit and say, think about yourself at 80 years old, try to empathize with the problems that you're going to have, people they can't do it. They freeze up. Whereas if you try to empathize with somebody who's a stranger to you, but right there, you can do it because you can visualize them. You've got this frame of reference.
It's very tangible. It's very real. Right?
Yeah. But we apparently, as humans, we suck about thinking about the future, which is why I think so many of us are just terrible to our future selves. We're like, exercise. Who needs it? Right? Sun cream. Who needs it? And all these other sort of decisions that we make that aren't necessarily perhaps the most empathetic decisions for our future. Right. And so this is actually asking ourselves to think about what's the future of our products. What are the future steps that we need to really think about to get us here? Right. And it's not just drawing a line saying, our happy line is this. but it's really thinking about what does that take? How do we visualize that? And therefore, what steps do we need to take to get there?
Yeah, I like your idea of your future self. I think of it as trade-offs, like what trade-offs is the future self and the present self making itself, right? So you might be on a diet and you decide to, as a one-off eat a cake, and you're making a trade-off. You're saying, you know what, I'm prepared to trade off this version of my future self with my current self. But you need to acknowledge that. You need to acknowledge that both these things exist, and you're constantly shaping what that future self is.
Right. Yeah. And I guess the product version of that is, I see that our product is, we want to be here, but, we're just going to build this one feature for this one client. That's July written off, but that's okay because we've still got August and September and the rest of the months to do, discovery work that's going to help us do this kind of work. That's fine if you do just that one thing, but if you do that one thing every month, you've sold off every month and not really thinking about what's actually going to get you to do something really transformative to your product. You're never going to do that big swoop, right?
It's interesting because it doesn't just make you think about what else you should do, but it sometimes makes you think about what you absolutely shouldn't do or even remove, right? So it really makes you think about what should be in scope. And that's, again, it's not just adding things, it's maybe taking things away or making sure there are certain things you absolutely avoid because it doesn't bode well for that future version of your product.
And that's a good point, like adding, taking away, multiplying, and Jacob actually asked a good question in the chat. He said both plus and multiply imply that the order doesn't matter. How important in your experience is it to stack in the right order?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Obviously, in some ways, all models are wrong, right? So I use that as really an analogy to explain things. But actually, I do find this, again, there's no right or wrong, but the question you need to ask yourself is, what are you optimizing for, right? Because it might be that there are trade-offs in terms of how quickly do you want something out there. And actually, I do think about the sequencing, right? Because what if you could do certain things? In the example I gave, everything was a multiplier, right? In some ways, but actually some things are still additives. And so actually pulling some of the multipliers forward, you might think, okay, that's an additive. I do need to do that, but it's going to be additive. It's not going to compound. And other things are multipliers. Actually, can I bring those multipliers forward? That's one version of it. And actually, are there certain multipliers that compound better than others, right? And you need to kind of play around with some of that sequencing to understand what the right trade-off is, depending on what you're optimizing for.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit like if you're building in, say, the B2B world, right? I've got some experience in this. And when you're building in that, you've got to think about, different types of requirements. Like some things you've got to do because they're just basic requirements, like having security or meeting GDPR requirements or stuff like this, right? And these are just hygiene requirements, right? Sometimes something comes in, it's like, look, all of a sudden you've got this new requirement, you've got to have this stuff to hit GDPR stuff. That's like an additive thing. And you could do it ahead of time, or you could do it just on time. You don't want to be behind the schedule because that could get you in trouble, but it's not going to multiply you, right? It basically becomes table stakes. Or you could do this other thing, which actually, if you created this thing that added, like a referral mechanism, and you brought that in earlier in your product, that could get you from 10 to 100 customers, and from 100 to 1,000, and from 1,000 to 10,000 earlier than if you waited until it was way too late, much later in the product. Like you could spend a long time just building like the basic building blocks of a great product, but that doesn't actually grow. There's nothing in there that gets people to share it or doesn't have the so what yet, right? So there's a lot that you could really think about going, you could do a lot of stuff, but none of these things actually really have the oomph yet. And so this is, I think, about the order really makes you think about which things are going to front load that so we can take these bigger steps upwards.
Absolutely. And also, what lever are you moving on? Typically you've got the levers of retention, acquisition, attraction, increasing LTV, lifetime value. So there are a few levers that you have there, and you might be pulling on one lever. So for example, a classic one to value stack, I guess, is onboarding. But that's a very simplistic example. I think that's relatively generic in the sense that you get that right because it's early in the sequence. Everything else tends to get better, right? And
Yes.
everything else benefits from it. And so that might be more of a acquisition/retention play. You've got other very simplistic, maybe less compounding value, far less, in fact, is maybe just, you have a ton of support tickets that is really sucking up energy and the velocity of the team, right? And actually you think, you know what, if I do this now, the value I get is not so much the value to the customer. There's still value to the customer, but I freed up this engineering time. I've now increased my engineering capacity by 20%. That's a different form of stack, because now you're extracting more capacity from the team. But why not do that earlier?
Yeah. And that's actually a really good point. I think that actually speaks to, Lucy asked a question. She said, can you give an example of how value stacking could be applied to choose one feature, a set of features over another? And, you're just saying, you could apply it to things that are further up the funnel, like onboarding, acquisition stuff, or things that are more costly.
Yeah, so I think that's the key thing, is understand the outcome that you want, right? So the mapping I have here, very simplistic, I have is we want to make some form of business impact, right? Like I say, think in SaaS terms. Do we want to increase retention? Do we want to increase the number of customers we acquire? Do we want to increase the lifetime value from each of our customers, right? Okay, which lever are we trying to pull? Great. Now map the problems to that impact. And so that's the customer outcomes, right? So now we're connecting the customer outcome with the business impact, and then focus on that set of problems, right? So focus on the opportunities that map to that. So knowing the lever I think you want to pull will help better understand the set of opportunities you should focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I liked so much about the value stacking, was how it works so well with the now, next, later framework, because it is really about thinking about the sequence of events or a sequence of steps that you need to take in order to reach the ultimate outcome, the vision of the product.
Yes.
What needs to happen now, what needs to happen next, what needs to happen later. And there could be multiple things that need to happen. And it really gets you thinking about that sequencing. But I think your way of framing it really gets you thinking about those multipliers, or front loading the problems that should be solved up front, rather than just a list of stuff to do, which I think a lot of people tend to fall back on it without without being forced to think about it that way.
Yeah, and personally, I have to say, and I didn't understand why initially. I was really struggling with all these methodologies like RICE, etc. And I think because I was trying, what are you working, what are we working towards, right? And so it definitely helps me just at least to work towards something bigger. And it's a way, because all of these frameworks sound great, but if you don't even know where you're headed, if you don't know your direction, it doesn't matter what framework you're quite frankly.
Yeah.
Like that always comes first. It doesn't matter how fast you run if you're running in the wrong direction, right?
Yeah. Now, I've got a question here from Oliver, and he says, how does value stacking differ from optimal sequencing?
Optimal, not familiar with optimal sequencing, and maybe it does done is come up with just less syllables. I don't know.
He's just clarified. He said he made up that term, but he made it sound really official by putting it in quotes. So it sounded like it was another framework. And I'm like, oh, I mean, yeah. It sounds like it's another good term for it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, have you seen other terms or other frameworks that sort of sit alongside value stacking, or other ways that segue with it?
So I can tell you this. So what's front of mind for me, I'm actually currently going through quarterly planning with my team.
Yeah. So
a lot of planning works come to mind when we say this, and value stacking is one part of that. There are certain planning principles that I'm happy to share here that we've been using. Yeah, so one is around, in fact, I think I've got a couple of slides on this. Maybe, let's have a look.
Oh yeah, share away.
Let's have a look. Let's see what I've got. What have I got?
And I love when we can go into practical, like, okay, so how does this actually play out in things like your quarterly planning? Like, what is this? What do you do day to day?
So I would say this is not, it's more a complementary framework that I'm thinking of, right? So this isn't just value stacking itself, but more around planning. So one thing that I think about here is, like, right now, before we even get into, okay, we think to ourselves, okay, we want to work on something, and we instantly go into what we want to do. And the first question I tend to ask myself during planning, because I manage quite a few teams here, so kind of I want to look more broadly. like what types of investments are. And the analogy I used here is maybe around investment portfolio allocation, right? In some ways, we have that in product, right? We have product allocation, right? Or planning allocation in product. So KTLO is my shorthand for keep the lights on, by the way. And I'm not let's not even going to bother going into the definitions that we use, but you can have any categories that you want, whatever you want to call it, right? So we've got KTLO, retention, strategic bets, tech debt, squad bets. We tend to have 5 categories. And the first thing I ask myself is, hey, all up, what is our allocation, right? And so what do you think about, as a matter of interest, Janna, when you look at this? What are your first thoughts as someone who runs a business? What are you thinking when you see this? Without even understanding the terms.
I really like this, because what this is showing me is that there's strategic oversight into the allocation of the work that's actually happening, right? I think too often teams work on things because something has come up, like noise has happened in the backlog, or noise has happened from a customer, or whatever's come up in whatever sort of planning tool or wherever else, as opposed to taking this step back and saying, hey, actually it's our strategy that we're going to spend 30% of our time focusing on tech debt. Like, so many teams just don't actually spend that time and allocate how important is it to them to pay down tech debt. And your team is saying it's 30% important to pay down tech debt.
Yeah. I mean, in this example, what I'm taking is, we've got keep the lights on. There's a lot of effort just to keep the lights on, right? And so that is not somewhere I want to be, right? I accept it, don't like it. So how do we get that path, right? So even before we get into where we want to get to, is actually, where do we want our allocations, right? From an investment portfolio perspective, for example, and again, this is just completely made up, quite frankly, but we might want to say, you know what, quarter on quarter, we want to reduce our KTLO, and maybe we want to up our strategic bets. We're not there right now. See some squads to make their own bets as well. And then eventually get to a healthy level where we have a steady state, maybe in KTLO and retention, right? So you can have investments elsewhere.
I've got a similar set of slides where I talk about you being on this continuum between discovery-led and delivery-led. And a lot of teams find themselves being accidentally quite delivery-led, because they've gotten themselves in this habit of, just taking on, work from clients who have paid them to do some work here and there, or they're kind of agency style led as opposed to being discovery led. And so admitting and saying, hey, here's where we are, but let's say 80% of your work is like that, and only 20% of your time is spent in discovery. Okay, let's see if you can get that for next quarter, make that 70-30. Let's say if the quarter after that, you can get that 60-40. Like, even if you're just shifting it a little bit and bringing your team, like dragging your team into being more lean, then that's good movement. Like, we don't expect you to become 100% lean and, throw out everything and pivot tomorrow, but you probably can think of, from a strategic sense, where your team should be and how you actually want to divvy up your time.
Yeah. And it also gives you a lens to think about how to deal with incoming requests. We might say, listen, we have these 5 great things we could do, like 5 big bets we can make, right? But you look at this and go, yeah, that's great and all, but there's not enough oxygen here to do that. We need to pay this down. So you know what? I've got room for maybe 3, right? And guess what? If we keep paying this down, we can start opening up more and more capacity, right? So once again, it's kind of looking more longer term and understanding, by planning to open up capacity, that compounds as well, right? But it never looks pretty in the short term. You can milk that in the longer term.
I also like that it's deliberate, because what you can do is, if you're going into Q2 saying, this is what we think we're going to do, or going into Q3 saying, this is what we think we're going to do, then you can also retrospectively look back and say, this is what it actually panned out to be. Like, turns out it actually took us a little bit more time. We spent more time on tech debt or KTLO. So we couldn't spend that time on strategic bets. It came out of squad bets. This is what we actually got. And, this is what we learned from that.
Yeah. And you can even look at this other ways. Like, often you have teams that can be very, or maybe even execs, right? You might ask an exec and their focus may be quite short term, right? Just because you can see that. You can see, why don't we address these 5 enterprise customer requests? Because, we can make X amount of money, right? And so what you often find in that type of scenario, there's very little oxygen to do anything long term. And so in that scenario, I'd be really asking, should we invest 100% in short-term stuff and 0% in long-term. And it's really
kind
interesting.
of a rhetorical question.
Yeah, but it's interesting, right? Because previously the answer to that would have been, even though it's unstated, the answer is yes, actually, we should. But when you show the percentage, it's like, well, no, we don't want to invest nothing in long term. Like, interesting. Okay, so if that's the case, we can't work on all 5, but maybe we can work on 3 or 4. And then that's understood, right? So this gives you maybe a bit of a language to and fro. What's the right weighting you need to give?
Yeah, and percentages are really powerful like that, because it always shows that once you take something out of, like, if you want to put something in one pool, it's got to come out of somewhere. Like, the math just doesn't work. You can't just, hey, we need more here. Cool. Well, who's going to lose something?
And just one more to share with you. Just this we completely blurred out because I can't share any confidential information what we're doing in the planning, but I actually tried something out in the planning session that we did. So for those of you who use, Mural, Miro, FigJam, we happen to use FigJam, one of these whiteboarding tools. One of the struggles that our team has is actually visibility and transparency, right? So we have a region of around, let's say, 40 PMs and designers in my org. And so there have not just been silos formed between departments, but even in my own department, my own team, there are squads that don't know what other squads are doing, right? And so tried something that is really shouldn't work, but I tried it anyway. But I actually tried, say, hey, what if we did planning in FigJam? Right. And the idea of this was, why don't we just have everyone on the call? The first part of the call was just really, kind of took them through different sections. Okay, ran through vision and strategy, so everyone heard the same story in the same context. And then we did some kind of silent planning where teams would start putting up the key areas they focus on, KTLO, retention, etc. And it was very visible for everyone, and people could start adding comments. So is this great longer term? Honestly, no. You probably want to store this in somewhere like, or some other tool. But actually, what this did help is just create this really interesting environment to have a conversation. So it had a very temporary shelf life, honestly. It was literally just 2-3 days, but to create that visibility. How much that's working, not working, honestly, we're working through that. But it was quite interesting to be able to use this to increase that transparency and drive the right conversations. I think it was not so good resolving dependencies and resourcing, but it could help with the format.
Yeah, and you know what, honestly, like, there's nothing better than a whiteboarding session, just getting people in the room to identify what sort of constraints they have, what sort of problems they have on their plate, what sort of assumptions that they're making. There's nothing more powerful than that. And what you've done there is looks like a really fruitful session.
Yeah, it also weeds out, another interesting thing is it weeds out overlap, right? It's like, hey, Janna, working on X, I was kind of thinking of something that's kind of similar to X, but not quite. Suddenly now we're talking, right? Now we can actually come together. So those conversations are way more interesting when you start getting the synergies between peers than someone like me coming along and saying, hey, you need to do this or that. Like, the more interesting conversations are actually between the squads themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it prevents that whole feeling that it's coming down from you. It allows them to create their own ideas and work together on something, which actually brings me to Jacob's question. He dropped something into the chat. He said, with the planning allocation approach, how do you avoid this coming across as a top-down management decision that might feel detached from, on-the-ground reality?
Yeah. Good question, actually. So, in fact, it's really interesting. Before I came, everything was almost all bottom up. Like, literally every squad defined exactly what they did.
Right.
I asked everyone, how's it working? I said, love the autonomy. It's great. I love it. But actually, sometimes it's just nice to be given a direction, because I'm doing this and someone else is doing that. And it's quite jarring, right? We're starting to see breaks in the customer experience. And so there are aspects where it really makes sense for a squad to have full autonomy when they're working on a single or double persona problem, right, in the problem space, right? I have someone who really focuses on, for example, the accounting professional, the controller. They interview that person. They know more about their problems than anyone else. I don't. The insights I give are quite different. The insights I bring in are more market insights. Okay, so really thinking about some market moves. So we try and have a framework that gives enough alignment so all the squads are moving towards the Uber problem, and yet still give autonomy to teams to work within that space. And I'll give you one example of this. I think it was Oliver that asked this, right?
No, it was Jacob who asked that question.
Jacob?
Yeah.
Sorry, Jacob. Apologies, the wrong section. So one area is there's an area where we saw our support tickets increase significantly over a short period of time. And so we said, I gave the guidance. I said, folks, I think we need to really drastically reduce our squad bets until we get the SLAs back to a certain region. So that's a good example of where that overall guidance helps to focus attention collectively on the right areas. But yeah, it is definitely a balancing act.
Yeah. And, I mean, from my point of view, looking at that, just that planning allocation piece, that amount of information isn't like an overwhelming amount of direction from the top down. It's not like they're saying, this is what you need to do with that 10% or 15%. They're just allocating what budget is going towards each group. And as long as each group has, each area has enough to actually take a chunk out of the problems that are in that area, then each group has, okay, great, we can spend, 15% of our time working on these types of bets. Okay, well, now it's up to you to make the most out of that. You better have a prioritized list of things that you want to do with that and make the most of it. Now, if you can do 10 bets with that 15% of your time, cool. If you can only do 2, cool, right? Like that's up to you as a team to be effective with that time and then show the results to the management so that you're given more leeway to do it again next month or next quarter.
Yeah, spot on. And there are very exceptional scenarios where I would say it's completely top down. In fact, really want to stay away from that. But, when I remember Pipedrive, when the pandemic, we said all bets are off. We're just doing these 5 things.
Right. It's like when management's got to grab the wheel and be like, look, something has changed.
That is by exception. That is.
Yeah, can be really tough at certain times, but can be transformative for the business if management knows what they're doing. If they don't know what they're doing, they can absolutely drive it into a wall.
They can accelerate our decline. Sure.
Assuming that they're informed and it's short term and it's driving people and saying, okay, great, we just need to take the wheel for a moment so that we drive everybody, get everybody going in the right direction, then great. But it can be tragic if it's in the wrong direction, of course. Definitely. Yeah. You mentioned something as you were talking about that team-wide thing about dependencies. I mean, how do you handle dependencies in your team? How do you communicate them and manage cross-team dependencies and inter-team dependencies and all that?
By the way, if anyone's really nailed dependency management, please call me.
I like asking this question because no one has, and I like seeing how other teams do it, because I think if we talk about it enough, maybe we'll start sussing out like proper answer.
Actually, it's really interesting. So one of the reasons I did the FigJam thing is was to make this incredibly transparent. What we did was we said, listen, you see that squad there, squad A, squad B has an ask. And what happened was I just literally got them to create a card, post it, and they put their ask, visually speaking, directly on their board. So everyone could see the asks. They could see, and you could see, wait, there are 10, 15 asks of this squad, yet there's 2 for this. So it's very interesting to see everything in one context rather than just individually, right? Because it's like a game of Jenga. You move one of these blocks and it has this cascading effect to everything else. So having to see everything, just creating that holistic visibility alone was super useful, because it already starts to make you understand where the critical path is, the single points of failure, and starts the conversation in terms of the right trade-offs. So that's one I have to say we tried out recently, and we've actually been having follow-on squad calls. So we have the PLT, the product leadership team, they have in-depth sessions with every single squad. And the key 3 things we're really looking for is, are you focusing on the right things when we go through the review? We have a key 3 plan review with every single squad. So we're halfway through that, 7 of about 14. Do you have any key dependencies that to be done? And 3 is, do you have any constraints, bottlenecks that we need to help you with? And then we just keep playing this game of, this is our capacity and this is how much we're going to take in, right? And we're always playing this game of, okay, what's the right trade-off? It also helps inform our account asks. So we can understand if we start signaling, look, we can't solve it now, but maybe in the next quarter we can start being in a better place, get the right headcount.
Those are exactly the right types of questions. And, fundamentally, as far as I can tell, there's no right way to do it besides just lots of communication. Like, when you're going to have these dependencies, you've got to have people talking to each other. If you're going to have lots of people with different asks of each other and different nodes of communication, you've got to get them in a room, whether a virtual room or a real room, together to have these conversations. In ProdPad land, what we basically have is in the now, next, later format, we recommend that people outline dependencies directly on their cards. So you can see on the roadmap card on these different problems that need to be done and the different cards owned by different teams, basically saying this one's dependent on this team and this one's dependent on this team. And that way you can see it all laid out in one place. And that way, if something does need to be moved, you can see, oh, hey, this one, I need to go talk to this person, or this one's dependent on a whole bunch of stuff. Let's go talk to these people before I go and shuffle it away.
It is a tricky one because I think we as humans are not very good at understanding second and third order effects. And being able to visualize that, it gives you a better insight of, okay, if A, then B, and then C, like the consequences of this is such.
Yeah, absolutely. So how often do you do these planning sessions?
Oh, I guess like most people, we have a quarterly planning session. So once a quarter is typically in the middle of the quarter. Yeah. We start spinning up the engines and say, okay, let's start thinking about the next. Obviously, they're all constantly thinking about the next quarter, right? But the healthy muscle we try and develop is, do you actually have any thoughts beyond the quarter? Because I'd like to see what's your value stack look like? Okay, sure, here's the next quarter, but what comes after that? So we try and expose some of those conversations even in quarterly planning.
Yeah. It's really good insight, and this has been really valuable. I'm not seeing any of the questions popping up from the audience, so I think we'll call it there. But Krishna, thank you so much for taking the time to chat here today. I want to say thank you, everybody, for taking the time to hang out and drop your questions in today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Wonderful. Thanks very much. Talk to you again. Bye for now.